there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our Disney series, and in today's video we're going to be covering none other than Sword in the Stone from 1963. So if you like what you're seeing already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also as well check out the rest of our Disney playlist, and also don't forget obviously in the future stay tuned for many more of our other videos covering different directors and producers and stuff, right? So without further ado, we're going to dive straight into this. So if you've seen one of these videos before by us, you'll know how the setup is. So we have it split into 6 different sections. So we have the story of the story of the creator, the story of the studio, the themes and the history, the legacy, and any notable lines and notable effects within the films. So without further ado now, we're going to dive straight into the story of the story regarding this film. So buckle up and let's go for the ride. So the 1963 film is actually based on a book of the same title from 1938, and this was written by T.H. White. We'll talk about him a little bit later because the plot for this is very, very different than what it was in the original. And also as well, I should say that it was re-released in 1958. But either way, the story is very different. And we'll see this now as we dive into the plot of A Sword in the Stone. So our story starts with the death of the old king. And when he dies, there's something that comes down from heaven. And this is a sword in an anvil. And on this sword, it says, "Whosoever pulleth out this sword and anvil is right wise king, born of all England." So basically, long story short, you pull out the sword and you end up becoming king of all the land. So obviously everyone in the whole kingdom is trying their luck, right? So everyone tries to pull it out, none are able to. And so over a period of time, people end up just basically forgetting about this, and England end up descending into a new dark age. So in the midst of the forest, this is where we see Merlin, who's the wizard, and we also see his pet owl, Archimedes. So Merlin is expecting a boy to come, and he doesn't know exactly who the boy is, but he knows exactly where he's going to land. And he can see, with the use of his magic, a boy coming along. So this is where we see the wart, whose real name is Arthur, with Kay. So the wart is basically the assistant of Kay, and while Kay is hunting a deer, the wart makes a mistake, and then the arrow goes flying off into the forest. So the wart says, "Right, don't worry about it, I'll go and get the arrow." And as he's going to get the arrow, this is where he falls slap bang right into the middle of Merlin's house, exactly where Merlin expected him to be. And within this house, this is where Merlin shows him all the different inventions, he shows him all the different like magic. But as impressed as he is by this, he's like, "I need to get back to the castle." And so Merlin, with the help of some magic, packs up all of the house into a tiny little briefcase, and they go off to the castle where the wart lives. So back at the castle, this is where Sir Ector lives. So Sir Ector is the foster father of the wart, and this is where he ends up meeting Merlin for the first time. So at first he's a little bit skeptical as to whether Merlin's a wizard, but after Merlin does a few spells, he managed to convince Sir Ector to let him stay in the castle to be the tutor of Arthur. And while Merlin is adjusting to the new tower that he's staying in, this is where Sir Pellamore comes, and he announces that there's going to be a tournament on New Year's Day in London that will determine who the next king will be. And so Ector decides that Kay will take part in order to become king, and this is where the wart is going to assist him. So obviously, like, they're practicing the jousting, they're practicing all these kind of things that like medieval people do in those times. But as Merlin sees this, he decides that he's going to plot and he's going to teach Arthur that there's more to life than medieval servitude. And so he turns him into a fish. And the two of them go for a swim in the moat, and everything's all going great up until the point where they see a pike, and this pike tries to eat them. And so the wart, as this tiny little fish, has to learn how to outsmart the pike, and this is where he learns a valuable lesson of brain over brawn before Archimedes eventually ends up saving him. So of course the wart has gone back to Sir Ector and to Kay now, and has tried to say this story about the fish. However, Ector basically thinks it's a bit of a fishy story, and as punishment, he sends him to go and do the dishes. But then Merlin comes and he uses magic to help save the wart from doing the dishes, and they go on yet another adventure. This time they become squirrels. So while they're running about in the trees, this is where a female squirrel ends up falling for Arthur, and in the end she ends up having to save him from being eaten by a wolf. But when Merlin comes and turns Arthur back into a boy again, this is where she's heartbroken, right? So it's actually a really like sad thing. She's kind of like tearing up and stuff, but there's nothing that Arthur can do. And again, this kind of teaches a valuable lesson of the importance of love. Now back at the castle, Hector discovers the magic dishes and he really has a go at Merlin, but of course Merlin ends up disappearing, and as punishment for this, Hector says that Wart no longer can go to London, right, to help Kay. So obviously the Wart is very distraught by this, but Merlin uses this opportunity to basically say, well, you should kind of continue on with your studies. So the next day, up in Merlin's tower, Merlin's trying to teach him all this very complicated stuff about, the world not being flat and about many different just very basic things, right? However, Archimedes goes, hold on, just slow down a bit. You need to teach him the basics, right? So he teaches them his ABCs. And as he's learning his ABCs, this is where Merlin starts playing with a flying machine that ends up breaking. And this gets Arthur to start thinking about being a bird, right? So he ends up fantasizing about flying. And so Merlin turns him into a bird. And so Archimedes takes him along and they go for a flight. So everything's all going well until a hawk comes and starts chasing them, right? And this is where he ends up flying straight into the house of Madam Mim. So Madam Mim is this crazy old evil witch, and she's really into black magic, and she tries to destroy Arthur, right? Up until the point when Merlin comes in and saves the day. And the two of them end up having a wizard's duel. So this is where they turn into different animals to try and beat the other one. So Merlin in this always plays the kind of underdog, whereas Madam Mim always plays as the bigger, kind of stronger animal and stuff. But eventually Merlin ends up outsmarting her, and this is where he basically turns into a virus and she ends up becoming very sick. So again, this teaches a lesson to basically use your brain, as opposed to trying to be strong all the time. So back at the castle, Kay's assistant has now become sick, and so Arthur ends up going to London with Kay. But upon hearing this news, Merlin flies into a rage and he flies all the way off to Bermuda to go on holiday. So Arthur now is on his own, and when he's in London with Kay, he realizes it's just too late that he left Kay's sword back at the inn. So in the quest to go and find a new sword, he comes across Excalibur, which is the sword from the very beginning of the story. And he pulls it out and gives it to Kay. And this is when they realize that this is actually Excalibur. And they don't believe at first that Arthur's the one who actually pulled it out. So they take him back to the anvil, they put it back in, all the men try to lift it up. But then Arthur comes along, takes it out with ease, and all of them fall to their knees and hail their new king, King Arthur. So of course, Arthur's just a boy, and so he kind of never wanted to be king, he never wanted all this. So he and Archimedes try to escape, but when he realizes that escape is impossible, this is when Merlin comes back from holiday and says, you will be a legend, people will talk about you for centuries and centuries to come, they'll make books about you, hell, they might even make a motion picture about you. And that's the end of The Sword in the Stone from 1963. So that of course covers the story of the story, but now we're going to explore the story of the creative process that went into the making of this film. So like we said, the film is based originally off of a book written by T.H. White in 1938, and the whole premise of the story is built upon the omission by Sir Thomas Molloy. So he is the one who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur in 1485, and this basically is where we get the stories of King Arthur from. So the omitted part of this is to do with King Arthur's childhood, which isn't explored in those older stories, but is what T.H. White decided that he was going to focus on. Also as well, something to note is that T.H. White was very influenced by Freudian psychology and had had a lifelong involvement in the natural world. So you can really see both elements of this kind of coming through within the actual story itself. So all the way back in February of 1939, so this is just a year after the book came out, Disney went and bought the rights to the actual story and intended to make it into a film. However, for various different reasons, there was just more pressing projects that kind of came up, as we've covered in our previous videos, of course. So in the 1940s and 1950s, the story kind of got put on the back burner and they didn't make a film of it. So in 1960, in the preparation for 101 Dalmatians, Disney said that there was going to be two films that were coming out in the 1960s, with one of them being Chanticleer, I think I've pronounced that correctly, and this is basically a story by Edmond Rostand. So this is the same person who wrote Cyrano de Bergerac. I've seen the play and I still don't know how to pronounce it, so if I've said it wrong, apologies. So the story is basically about a rooster and there's other farmyard animals as well, and so that was going to be a film that was going to come out at the same time as Sword in the Stone was going to come out. However, Disney ended up picking Bill Peet, who was the sole writer for 101 Dalmatians, which covered in the last video, right? And he asked him once again to be the sole writer for this film, yeah, which was going to be The Sword and the Stone. And he said that the Chanticleer was going to be scrapped. So this really angered Bill Peet because, first of all, the reason that Disney actually stated was that, you don't want to pet a rooster, like no one wants to pet a rooster. But that doesn't really make any sense because no one wants to pet a boy. Like, that's just a little bit sus, it's a little bit weird, right? So on that logic, it doesn't make any sense. But also as a fact of they'd really kind of started work on the Chanticleer and it was more contemporary, etc., etc. But the real reason why Disney actually kind of like threw it under the bus was because in 1960 you had the Broadway musical, which was Camelot. And this was basically what inspired him to kind of go, oh yeah, I think we've got a story about King Arthur. Let's pull this up from the works from like 2 decades ago, right? So that was the real reason why he did the project. And perhaps because of this, right, Bill Peet, when he did the first draft of this, didn't actually, he wrote a script and it didn't actually have any storyboard with it. So in the second draft of it, this is where he puts in a storyboard, and what he basically does with this is he changes about a lot of the story, right? And what he does is he emphasizes more of the dramatic parts of it, because what he found while writing it is that the Arthurian legends have many complicated elements to it, and there's many kind of overlaps, and obviously it's from many different sources and stuff. Yeah, it's not just one book that you kind of look to as canon. So it was quite difficult to kind of work out how to kind of make a story of this. So instead, that's why the kind of story kind of darts from one kind of thing to another in that kind of way. So now that we've covered the story of the creative process that went into the making of this, right, now we can look more at the story of the studio. So Roy O. Disney, he was the older brother of Walt, and at this time, he just wanted to basically just make a bunch of re-releases of Disney films because they was like, you know what, these are profitable enough, we've made enough films, we don't need to make any new content, let's just keep re-releasing the same old stuff. And I'm so glad that he didn't do this because this is basically what Disney does nowadays. It just re-releases things and it remakes like things instead of kind of creating like new content. And it's, boo to him, yeah, boo to Roy. I'm glad that Disney stuck with his guns because obviously all the films that have come since this point would never have been made if Roy was the one who was in charge. However, the thing to kind of note is that in this period, like we said in previous videos, Walt Disney at this point, he was really focused on making a new theme park. So he already had, I think, Disneyland, and they want to make Disney World, or might have got the wrong way all round or whatever. But the point being that because he was so focused on theme parks at this stage in his life, he ended up being very much distracted. And so as a result of that, he was only able to make a new film maybe like once every 4 years or so, right? Which explains the kind of like slow uptake of films during this time. So like we said in the last video, where we talked about 101 Dalmatians, we had Xerox photography. Now, this was used again as a technique. However, in order to kind of like speed it up, this process now had assistants, right? So the people who'd like run about and kind of like help like the process to be more streamlined. However, the problem is that these assistants, a lot of them were kind of new and stuff, and they were very nervous of Milt Cole, who we spoke about in previous videos. And what they were really nervous about was that the speed of the process would end up messing up the line work, which Milt Cole still drew by hand. So that's just a little bit of trivia in terms of the kind of logistics of that. Like the assistants running about, trying to do their best, but they were a little bit scared of like what Milt would say. Also as well, this is the very first Disney film which features songs by the Sherman Brothers. So nearly all the other Disney films that came out in the 1960s and 1970s, it was written by the Sherman Brothers, right? So we have them to thank for that. And on that note, we're going to start talking about the casting of the actual film. So because it's a relatively low budget film and Disney kind of like learned his lessons from prior films, he didn't want to have too much of a kind of star-studded cast. So that's why many of the people here, you'll be like, I've never heard of these people, never seen them in anything else, etc., etc. So this is the kind of list as we go down. So first of all, Arthur, or the Wart, is played by 3 different actors. I don't know why they had 3 different voice actors for this, but either way. So you have the first one, which is Ricky Sorensen, and he is the voice of Spotty in 101 Dalmatians. Again, there's 101 Dalmatians, so no one knows like which one was Spotty, but whatever, yeah. So you have him, and also you have 2 brothers. This is Richard and Rob Reifferman, and even within the same scene sometimes, you can hear the different voices. But it's not like in Bambi where there's like a younger person and there's a middle-aged person. There's nothing like that, right? It's just in the same scene, it's all mishmashed, right? So anyway, you had those three for Arthur's role. And for the role of Merlin, you had Carl Swenson, and he appears in The Birds. You had Junius Matthews, and he is the voice of Archimedes, and he's also the voice of Rabbit in Winnie the Pooh. You had Sebastian Cobert, and he is the voice of Hector, and he's also the voice of the narrator at the beginning. So he appears in The Time Machine very briefly, and also he is the voice of Bagheera, who we're going to cover when we go into the video to do with the Jungle Book, right? So definitely stay tuned for that. For the voice of Kay, you have Norman Alden. The only notable film I could see that he was in was the war film Tora 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 from, I think, 1973. I could be wrong with that. And then also you have Phil Ravenscroft. He is the voice of Sir Bart. So he only has one or two lines in this, and he is a very deep voice actor. You can see him in many other films which you have on screen at the moment. And then finally, in terms of notable people, you have Barbara Jo Allen, who is the maid in this. And also, well, we kind of covered her in more depth in our video to do with Sleeping Beauty. And she is the voice of Fauna in that. So, you know, definitely like go back and watch that video for a bit more like kind of in-depth information in regard to that. So that kind of covers the casting of it, right? And explains the story of the studio. So now we're going to look at the kind of themes and the history of this story. So in terms of the themes for this, it's obviously very influenced by nature, right? And just looking at like the natural world. And it's kind of, it's not necessarily like survival of the fittest as we think of it, right? It's more, I suppose, fittest in a kind of broader sense in terms of it's survival of the smartest as opposed to just the strongest, right? So it's again this thing of brain over brawn, which is the message which is kind of hammered through time and time again. It's also a kind of celebration of a rags to riches story, which is obviously a common trope, which we see in many things. And it's also, it kind of celebrates the underdog, right? So at the beginning of the film, he's just the wart, like he's not even referred to by his own name. And by the end of it, the very people who just dismiss him as the wart end up bowing to him as like their rightful king. So it's very kind of interesting in terms of like the themes with regard to that. And talking about the kind of like history, I suppose one could kind of say that like films like this were becoming more common in the 1960s. So you had lots of kind of counterculture things in a way where the underdog was being celebrated more. So rather than it being this kind of like strong like hero, if you think about like the hero in many other like Disney films, they're kind of like the strong, muscular kind of like prince and stuff. Whereas for him, he's very much kind of like starting off at the bottom and stuff, right? He's a scrawny little runner, and yet he ends up becoming the king. And so with regard to the history of this kind of ties into the legacy of the film. And as a whole, this was a very, very successful film. So it had a budget of just $3 million, but in box office rentals alone, it made $4.75 million. And then when the film was re-released in 1977, and then also in 1983, it made a total of $14.5 million, yeah, for money back then. So in total, in the US and Canada alone, it made, in terms of its lifetime gross, it made $22.2 million. So financially, it was a very successful film. Just like many of the other films that Disney was kind of making in this era, it kind of learnt lessons from Sleeping Beauty, not to kind of do overly complicated like that things again. However, you can kind of see this in the fact that there's not really any kind of like notable lines or notable effects within this, right? It's a very kind of simplistic film. So whereas Sleeping Beauty, for instance, has many different camera angles and it has, you know, there's more kind of intricate kind of like things. For this, it's a very kind of plain film. The background's relatively plain. They're in the forest, but like you don't really notice it for most of the time. There's not a great lot of detail. And also as well, in terms of notable lines, there's lots of like funny bits within this, but there's not like notable lines, right? Apart from, of course, this.
And now the G. You see, it's as simple as no, boy. Now use your head, use your head. Will you? How do you ever expect to learn anything?
And then this. And then this.
Rule 2, no make-believe things like, pink dragons and stuff. No dragons, remember? Did I say no purple dragons? Did I?
And then, of course, the many, many. So you can see that these are like quite funny, but it's not like great, right? And compared to like the other Disney films that we've looked at, it's kind of very plain. And this is why many of the critics said it had a very thin narrative, right? Because the storyline kind of darts between one kind of thing to the next, yeah, right? Kind of goes from one lesson to the next, and it's like the actual, not much actually happens in the story when you actually think about it. It's a good film to watch. It's entertaining. Like, you're not going to be bored when you're watching it and stuff. But at the same time, it's like they could have had a little bit more to it. And yeah, I suppose if you do a low budget film like this, you're going to end up having problems like that where it's not, you know, it's not as good as it could have been. But at the same time, it does the trick. And on the whole, I think it's a really great film. So I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't watched it already. Also, as well, spoiler alerts for, again, the film came out like almost 60 years ago. So that's your fault if you haven't gone and seen the film already. But the next film which we're going to be doing is Mary Poppins from 1964. So definitely stay tuned for that. And also as well, if you like this video, don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified. And also, like we said, go and check out the other films that we've looked at from the Disney playlist. And yeah, without further ado, have a great day and bye.